We'd like to keep going now with, first off, I have a few questions that I'll ask myself, and then if we open it up to everyone else. And the first is, I suppose, on the interesting subject of interest rates. I suppose in hindsight, a lot of people would wonder at first in the crisis when interest rates were raised by the ECB and then later, subsequently, obviously reduced an awful lot. I suppose from your point of view, what interests me is, do you think in hindsight that it was the right decision to raise interest rates, and are you satisfied with that? Or do you think it might have possibly been better to lower them?
We were in a very, very special situation. And as you know, there was two monetary policy instruments that were at our disposal in this very difficult period of time. One was what I would call the totally unconventional measures, on the one hand, and the other one was the interest rates. And we had the handling of this complex situation in a situation where we had still, at the moment of the interest rates moves that you mentioned, inflation quite a high level, and some, I would say, threat of destabilization of the anchoring of inflation expectations in the crisis. So the ECB decided at the time to do the following: to be extremely bold in terms of non-conventional measures. The first incredible boldness, which remains today the privilege, if I may, of the central bank, was to give unlimited supply of liquidity. Whatever liquidity the commercial banks would ask, they would get it, with the only limit being the overall eligible collateral. So that was, something which was never done by the United States Fed, or never done by the other central banks. And when time comes, we embarked on purchasing treasuries of a number of countries, particularly Greece, Portugal, Ireland, at a time where there was, it was considered extraordinarily bold to embark on such purchase of some treasuries. We were not in the universe of the QE, it was the targeted purchase of some treasuries, plus other non-conventional means, the first purchases of covered bonds, for instance. So you see, the idea of the ECB at the time was, I know that a lot of public opinions will be shocked by what we do. Those public opinions will be very shocked by the purchase of treasuries. They will be very shocked by the fact that we are giving liquidity without any limit, and that we are, embarking on an off-balance sheet commitment. And that could be part of the destabilization of our expectations. So at the same time, the central bank decided to show to all the fellow citizens in Europe that we were doing all what was necessary to cope with exceptionally dramatic circumstances, but that we were maintaining the anchoring of inflation expectations against inflation, of course, but also against deflation, because the communication was, we want our inflation expectations to be very close to 2 full stop. And again, at the time, potentially, there was the two threats, but one was the immediate threat, and the deflation was a threat which was not visible at the time. But I take it that in demonstrating that we were inflexible on being as bold as possible on the non-conventional measures, and I would say in line with our definition of price stability as regards the anchoring of inflation expectations, we were doing in the circumstances which are very, very complex, of course, and always difficult, and were always difficult, but we were doing what we had to do, again, in the circumstances.
Absolutely. My second question is far more on a human level. I can't imagine what it would be like to have the knowledge that you had and to be in the position you were, and yet also to have to show the level of deference that you did to political institutions and working with them. And I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about what it was like to have to deal with political institutions and even nations like Ireland and knowing what they had to do, but also having to toe that line in dealing with them. Was that very difficult?
I mean, it's exceptional circumstances, crises are very, very difficult. If you want to understand my psychology at the time, since 2003, I had fought fiercely against the non-implementation of the Stability and Growth Pact. And it was difficult. My first speech in the European Parliament was in December 2003. And at that time, the big countries in Europe had decided not to apply to themselves the provision of the Stability and Growth Pact. So since 2003, I was telling ministers and heads when time came, you should apply by the rules. It's not normal that you give the feeling that in a single currency area, when SGP was part of EMU, you don't respect SGP. Since 2003, I was appointed in 2003, in November 2003. Then in 2005, we realized, and I realized, that the main problem of the euro area was what I call the persistent divergences of cost competitiveness, persistent divergences of a number of imbalances, domestic and external. And I was circulating the evolution, country by country, of the unit labor cost and of the external imbalances at each meeting of the Ministers of Finance in the Eurogroup. Every month, each meeting, circulation of the charts, which were very clearly signaling that since the very beginning of the euro area, we had what I called persistent divergences. So when the crisis exploded, I have to say, I have a very vivid memory of that, of course. It was, we had first to take very bold decisions in 2007, and then there was Lehman Brothers. And then we had the start of a very, very important sovereign risk crisis in Europe at the end of 2010. Since Lehman Brothers, I continued every month to circulate these figures, these charts, which were demonstrating that we had tensions. And I was telling the governments something cannot go on forever. But no correction was taken, even if we knew that we were in a financial crisis of first magnitude. And so that might explain why it was, not that complicated to say, when we had been all in a difficult crisis, to do all what we could to help in these dramatic circumstances. I already mentioned the non-standard measures that we had taken, the illimited supply of liquidity, which was an incredible and fantastic help, of course, for the euro area as a whole. But at the same time, it was giving the possibility of passing messages, not substituting, of course, to anybody or to the European institutions, to the Commission, to the Council, but passing messages that were in the vision of the ECB, part of, I would say, what was seen again from the creditworthiness of the various countries, creditworthiness of the euro area as a whole, what was very important.
I think, especially when you consider that and how short-sighted an awful lot of people were being, it's incredible how well Europe managed to recover, and Ireland indeed. But my last question is about Ireland in particular. And I think a lot of people would be very impressed with the way that the reforms were able to be implemented and a bailout was arranged and Ireland has come so far. But I wonder, in hindsight, do you agree that the bailout needed to be, I suppose, as far-reaching as it was? Was it in fact necessary to guarantee all that the Irish government did? Or do you think in hindsight a more limited assurance could have done the same amount? Or do you think that the right decision was made?
It's a very, very complex question, of course. First of all, you remember that Ireland was the first country to embark on guaranteeing its banks at a time where no other country had embarked in such. I'm speaking of Europe. Of course, in the US you had the top agreement, the top program, and you had what the US had done for, in particular, AIG and a number of other institutions. But in Europe, I remember a number of heads calling me and telling me, did you see what was done in Ireland? And I said, no, I didn't see. They are guaranteeing their banks and so forth. And at that time, it was such an extraordinary period of time. Any public signature was considered much better than any private signature. Yeah. We were not yet at the level of the sovereign risk crisis. We were at the level of countering the financial risk, the financial private signature crisis. No, I consider that under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, Ireland did what he had to do, as all other countries. No other advanced economic country, let one of its institutions collapse or half collapse. And that was clearly because all heads, the Kanzlerin in Germany, all the prime minister or president or whatever, were telling there will not be any Lehman Brothers in my own courtyard, you can be sure. And it was a very, very clear-cut, across the board political commitment, or legal commitment depending on a country-by-country basis. So, of course, after the situation, you can always say, was it really appropriate to do that? And the conclusion we drew at the global level, because it was a global motto, it was not something which was peculiar to any particular country. It was really a global motto at the time. But the conclusion was we should have now new prudentials, new rules at the global level and in Europe that would prevent such events, that would prevent a systemic collapse of that kind, and that would permit us to let one particular institution going bankrupt without that bankruptcy creating a drama for all the system, which was, of course, that we had observed after Lehman Brothers. So I take it that all what has been done since then, progressively, and I would say at the global level, because what I'm mentioning is really the G20 orientation, the G20 recommendation. And of course the implementation was done by the Basel Committee, by a number of institutions like the GHOS in Basel and so forth. So we were in a situation, again, where one could say we should not permit such events, such destabilizing event to be observed again. But again, it was, the situation, very unfortunate situation before the crisis, and I hope that we are now doing sufficient hard work. But I would not be too, I would say, confident, because I have something to tell you which is important. If you take the globe, the planet, you look at the overall debt outstanding, public and private, at the level of the globe, and you consider the total debt outstanding, public and private, as a percentage of GDP, as a good indicator of the vulnerability of the system, of the financial system. The figures are the following. You could check maybe in a G30 publication on shadow banking, a recent G30 publication on shadow banking. In 2000, the percentage, the indicator I am mentioning, was at the level of 250%. In 2007, so immediately before the financial crisis I have been mentioning, we were at the level of 275% approximately. So plus 25% of the global GDP of global debt outstanding, public and private. You would expect that since the crisis, of course, we stopped that, and that the augmentation did not continue at that pace. You're wrong. You're wrong. It continued at the same pace. So that we were in 2015 at the level of 300%. 300%. The only difference is that the pace of accumulation of total debt outstanding in the advanced economy slowed down a little bit, but continued to augment. And it is in the emerging world that the 50% of the augmentation of this debt outstanding took place, particularly in China. But again, we are in a global economy. We know that we are all interconnected. We know that we are all in a situation where we are depending. We are totally interdepending. And you know that better than anybody in Ireland. So I draw your attention to the fact that perhaps when we will have the benefit of the hindsight in 10 or 15 years, we will say, yeah, there was the advanced economic crisis in 07-08, and then we had the global economic crisis in I don't know when. But again, I'm not reassured when I look at that indicator. Not reassured at all.
On that optimistic note, I'm fascinated by the future of Europe and how you think that'll progress, but you've already addressed that, and indeed I'm sure everyone else here would be more interested to ask their own questions on that topic and others. So we'll open it up to the floor now, and if you're interested, if you could raise your hand, we'll come to people one by one to pose questions. Individually, we have time for one or two. Just here in the front row.
Yeah, so if a structural engineer said to us now, oh, this pillar is looking unstable and there's a risk of the building collapsing, we take that very seriously. And if a doctor told us we need to undergo a certain course of treatments, we'd give that very serious weight. Whereas policymakers tend not to listen so much to academic economists, and certainly in public discourse, the understanding of economics and the appreciation of economic advice is not given much weight. Why do you think that is, and what do you think can be done to fix that?
If I understand well your question, you are telling that the decision makers are not taking sufficiently into account the economist recommendation, is that right?
Yeah, and people, voters, the public.
And people, voters. Well, decision makers, at least in democracies, have to take into account people, voters, because they are accountable, and when the people is not happy, they are thrown out. So, I mean, democracy is, of course, as said Churchill, the best system, the worst system, but after all others. So there is absolutely no doubt that there we have something which is important. My comment on that particular point would be the lucidity of your public opinion is the most important competitive edge presently in the present world. You know, if your public opinion understands and is as lucid as possible, then demagogy is not elected. Short-term consideration are not considered dominant over a longer-term consideration. The immediate satisfaction that you have as a, I would say, citizen, consumer, and so forth, is not taken as much more important than the prosperity of your sons or daughters or grandsons and granddaughters, and. And the arbitrage between short-term and medium-term seems to me to be absolutely fundamental. So first remark, which I draw from that, good communication in a country, not by government to the people, but good communication in the country, full understanding of how things are working, on what are the short-term consideration and the longer-term consideration and so forth. All this is extremely important. Now, you mentioned also the good advice given by economists. I think we are in a university here. I understand we are in the law university, not in the economic university, but I take it that there is an immense hard work to be done to continue to understand better in which universe we are, what are the new emerging properties of globalization and the generalized interconnectedness between economies, between firms, all sectors and so forth at the global level. And we are far from understanding fully how it works. And the proof of the matter is that when we had the crisis, our modeling was not, I would say, correct in terms of understanding what was going on. We had 3 quarters of collapse of the real economy, of the advanced economies, and these 3 quarters were always collapsing much more rapidly than all projections that we had. And I'm speaking of what was observed in the US as well as in Europe, you know. When we were looking at the ranges of likely behavior of the real economy, we were much lower than these ranges when looking quarter after quarter, and it lasted 3 full quarters. So that tells us something on the necessity to perhaps make big progress in the understanding of, again, what happens when you are in this new world. Because we are in a totally new world.
Just turn here, straight to my left.
Roland Earn, I'm teaching European integration in the business school. So my question is the following. Is, in the new economic governance regime, is there not a flaw? And the flaw is its methodological nationalism. So on the one side, we say we are living in an integrated European economy, but then we use indicators that look at nations one by one as if nations still control of the economy in their parts. And I'm saying that also because I'm coming here from Ireland. I'm not Irish, but I'm living here, of course. Ireland didn't have a public deficit problem, so it wasn't, but the reason that you mentioned doesn't apply, but nevertheless we ended up in the bailout. On the other hand, we came out, thanks to our international industry or international sector, where there was no wage cut, but so there was no wage restriction in the sectors that made Ireland actually coming out. Similar things in Romania also, so to speak. So Romania had even half the public debt as any other country, the lowest wages, but still the Troika, not the ECB, but the other institutions had to bail out Romania as well. And I think in the Romanian case it was because international banking, European banks took the money back to their home banks, and that posed a problem in the Romanian system. So what I'm saying is we are living in a situation where firms, and including Airbus yourself, firms are organized across nations. So the units of the European economy are actually transnational, and shouldn't we have an economic governance regime that takes into account these transnational connections rather than national blocks, as if we would still be based on a national system in some way?
No, of course I take your point. Still, I concentrated on the EMU, namely a single market with a single currency. And there you have to reason at the level of the single market with a single currency, exactly as the US has to reason. The mistake in the euro area would be to reason only on a national basis, because it would be totally contradictory with the commitment which has been taken to participate in this single currency area. I am a little bit troubled by what you said on Ireland, because my memory is that after the crisis erupted, the unit labor cost in Ireland came down very rapidly, and that cost competitiveness was regained admirably, I have to say. And one of the fantastic success of Ireland is really the flexibility of its economy. So Ireland did anything to maintain its competitiveness at a time where it was put into question. But
because of the public sector, but not in the sector that actually made us grow again. So in some sense, at the firm level of the economies that were successful, their wages of their employees in the pharmaceutical sector, for instance, didn't decline.
Yeah, of course, in a flexible economy, every firm adapts. But I can tell you that I have a lot of friends, and some of them are not Irish, but they had a property in Ireland, a secondary house in Ireland. And the anecdotes are absolutely striking, because in a totally private sector, somebody who was working in this house said the new remuneration is much lower than before. And the person had not said, I owe you too much, you should diminish. No, it was, I mean, everybody understood that it was necessary to get back as a country, as an economy as a whole, to competitiveness. So I don't dispute the fact that in a firm which is extremely prosperous, there was perhaps no reason to adjust. But I'm sure that you have export industries in Ireland which considered that they were about not to be as competitive as they should, and they probably took the decision to adjust. Otherwise, I could not have that at the aggregate level for the economy as a whole. But of course, your remark remains remarkably true. I mean, the value chain now are global. We are in a universe which has nothing to do with, as you said, a segmented universe. We are in a universe which is extremely interconnected in the production process of goods and services. But of course, the idea that we should now have a global governance which would be solid, I would say, well, let's try to do the job ourselves. I have no doubt that Switzerland will always behave properly, but the euro area has to prove again that it can run itself in a very efficient fashion. And there is an argument that, again, going back to the euro area, when we created the common market, the only role model that we have at the time was the US. The US was the single market with a single currency. That was the role model for the European. And the idea was we should have the same level of economy of scale as the US have and so forth. Today, we have the United States of America, which remains solid. We have China. China is already 2/3 of the GDP of the United States of America, and nobody has any doubt that they will overpass. It's a single market with a single currency. Now we have also India, which is galloping now more rapidly than China. Single market with a single currency. What about Mexico? What about Brazil? What about tomorrow Indonesia? I mean, you have enormous amounts of population economies that are now growing extremely fast. And the idea that it is time for the European to get back to their own, nations and to leave the EU and so forth at a moment where, again, the constellation of single markets with a single currency is so big in the world seems to be, totally contrary to common sense.
It really is a very optimistic note to end on, and I think we will have to draw to a close just there. But just to formally finish, on behalf of the Law Society, this is Honorary Life Membership. I'm very happy to award you for all of your contribution to Europe and indeed Ireland. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I will just highlight this way just behind.